You are about to enter the Shockwaves Skull Sessions podcast on ShockwaveSkullSessions.com. And now your host, Bob Nalbandian. What is going on, everybody? This is Matt Hartnett, co-host, producer here of the Shockwaves Skull Sessions podcast. Our beloved Bobfather, Mr. Nalbandian, unfortunately will miss again this week. He's still recovering from his throat surgery, although it's getting closer and closer to being 100%. He's feeling great. He's doing great. I mean, you guys should see the amount of chicks this guy's been picking up since he's had this voice. No joke. I mean, it's pretty unbelievable. I mean, Bob always does really well with the ladies, but I mean, he's just killing it right now, man. So, at the same time, even though I know he's going to miss his Don Corleone-esque voice, he's definitely wanting to get back to being the real Bob Nalbandian, as we all do. We can't wait for Bob to come back with his regular voice and kill it on these original Shockwave Skull Session episodes. So until then, we're going to go ahead and do what we did last week. We're going to put up a classic Shockwave Skull Sessions episode. And we'd also like to give a real special thanks to Chris Aiken from the Classic Metal Show for doing a kick-ass job filling in for Bob last week. He put on a really awesome episode. If you guys haven't checked it out yet, go ahead and do so. You won't be disappointed. Episode number 16. It's titled Platinum Seller Replacements. Featured Billy Morris and Eric Ferentinos, two guys who have played in platinum selling outfits, including Warrant, Quiet Riot, Stephen Pearcy from Matt, of course, as well as other bands like Trickster and Tough, a lot of those 80s bands. Really cool episode and really interesting topic. And so thanks again, Chris, who, as you guys all know, has been a regular here on the podcast for quite some time. So it's great to have him on and doing his own episode. This one's from back in 2011. It features famed author Martin Popoff, Neeley from the Classic Metal Show, as well as David Ellefson, bassists from the almighty Megadeth. And basically the discussion in this episode revolves around the grunge movement that ruled the music scene back in the early to mid-90s. So, I mean, a really cool episode for you guys all to check out. A lot of you guys have been requesting some old classic archive episodes from the old Shockwave Skull Sessions. So I think you guys are really going to enjoy this episode for sure. Also, some good news. Go to our webpage at www.shockwaveskullsessions.com to check out our new radio station, Shockwaves Radio. That's right, ladies and gentlemen. We've got our own radio station on the website, so get rid of those Spotify and iTunes subscriptions. No need. This is for free. You want to come to the website, check out our podcast episodes. You can also listen to Shockwaves Radio by clicking on the Listen Now button at the top of the page. We're playing all your favorite artists and songs, and I guarantee you will not be disappointed. Promise. Okay, check it out, Shockwaves Radio. The radio station is obviously in its infant stage still, so we're going to be adding a lot more to it, a lot more music, probably some other things, maybe possibly even a show. Okay, that's right, you heard. We might even have a live show playing new music. Okay, we have a couple of things in mind that we're thinking of doing. And we'll let you know when that comes up. We'll definitely keep you guys posted as to what's new with the radio station. But definitely check it out. And, of course, as always, go to our Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter pages for up-to-date news on the Shockwave Skull Sessions podcast. Also, feel free to shoot us any comments, suggestions, and questions to shockwaveskullsessions@gmail.com. We also want to thank all of you who have donated to the podcast. We really appreciate it. We hope you're enjoying the CDs and the DVDs that were sent to you in your package. For anyone else out there who would like to donate to the podcast, go ahead and shoot us a donation of $20 or more to shockwaveskullsessions@gmail.com at PayPal, and we will promptly send you out a package full of swag here that we really think you'll enjoy. And as I said, we really appreciate those of you who have already contributed. It's been a huge help in terms of keeping us afloat, and we're putting all these donations right back into the website, so it's not going into our pockets. So we really appreciate it, and we're going to continue to do as much as we can at the ShockwaveSkullSessions.com website. We're going to start including interviews and hopefully even some reviews going forward, but we'll keep you up to date on everything that's going on with that. So without any further ado, let's move on here to the Shockwave Skull Sessions archive, great archive episode from 2011, Blame It on Grunge, featuring David Ellefson, Neeley from the Classic Metal Show, and Martin Popoff famed author. Enjoy, guys.
Well, all right. Thanks for checking out an episode of the Shockwave Skullsessions podcast. This is a long-awaited discussion on the ever-popular, or perhaps the ever-not-so-popular grunge rock, and how it affected the whole 80s metal scene, from the hair bands to the thrash bands to everything else. And we got a great cast on this one. I've been waiting to do this episode for a while. This is a real good discussion, man. And we've got returning guests on this one. Of course, the great Martin Popoff. He's been on several of the previous Shockwave Skull Sessions podcast, a regular, so to speak. Mr. Martin Popoff, of course, the author of several great books on metal music. One of his most recent books is the great book on Deep Purple, a book entitled Getting Tighter, and he's also got several other great books. You can check out all his works on his website. That is martinpopoff.com. We also got returning guest Mr. Neeley from the Classic Metal Show, one of my very favorite internet radio shows and podcasts, the Classic Metal Show. You could always check Mr. Neeley out at theclassicmetalshow.com. They do their live radio show every Saturday night from 9 p.m. till 3 a.m. in the morning Eastern Standard Time. Mr. Neeley joins us along with our third guest, again, a returning guest, Mr. David Ellefson. Of course, David Ellefson, probably best known as the bass player in the classic thrash metal band Megadeth, as well as several other projects that you are probably very familiar with. Of course, F5, Iron Steel, Temple of Brutality, and Hail. So we're going to get right into this, man, because this is quite a long episode. So let me just let you know a few things before we delve into this great controversial topic. Once again, this is the Shockwave Skull Sessions. It is available on our homepage. That is roadrunnerrecords.com/skullsessions. You can check out each and every episode. You can listen to the episodes streaming online on that website. You could also download each and every episode from that website. And you could also go to iTunes, one of the most popular places to hear our podcast. Of course, just go to iTunes and type in Shockwaves in the search of the iTunes store. Both the Shockwaves Skull Sessions podcast and my other podcast, the Shockwaves Hard Radio podcast, they all pop up. Be sure to subscribe to both of them. Send in your comments, send in your opinions, rate the show, and if you want to email me directly, you can email me at shockwaveskullsessions@gmail.com. I do answer every email I get, so please send me your comments, especially about this episode, because this is a good one, man. This is a real good one. Of course, you know, we are going to be launching our Shockwaves, I should say the official Shockwaves website coming up real soon. That is at shockwaves.tv. It's still under construction right now. My partner, Patrick, has been putting up loads of news, and we've been getting a great amount of traffic. He's been kicking ass on the site, man. He put up a great Twitter page, which you could also contact us and follow us through Twitter. Go to twitter.com/shockwavesmedia, and I'm very proud to find out from Mr. Patrick that we are still the #1 Twitter site as far as heavy metal sites go. So way to go, Patrick. Totally kicking ass there. Once again, check us out at shockwaves.tv. And we will be launching the full site soon, but right now you can check out the latest metal news. Anyway, let's do it. This is the great grunge special, and rather than just focusing it on grunge, we're going to call it the grunge and the alternative rock metal scene of the 90s, just to make it a little bit more broadened, so to speak, and how it relates and affected the 80s metal scene, all varieties of 80s metal, not just the hair metal, but of course the thrash music scene and everything else when grunge came into play in the early 90s. And on our great panel, our great American panel, we got Martin Popoff from, of course, the extraordinary author Martin Popoff. Also does the Brave Words and Bloody Knuckles site. What's going on there, Martin?
Oh, nothing much. Looking forward to getting into this one. I'm probably the most passionate guy on the pro grunge side, I imagine, but we'll see.
Well, for those not familiar with Martin, he's written several books. You just did a new book on Blue Oyster Cult recently, right? Secrets Revealed.
Yeah, that was an updated version. It's 100 pages longer and a whole bunch of pictures and stuff. But the latest ones are probably the Deep Purple one, Getting Tighter, 68 to 76, 6, and the hardcover art book of Michel Langevin from Voivod.
Now that's interesting. That's just all his artwork, correct?
Yeah, it's really cool. It's a really nice book. Big hardcover, 3,000 copies, limited edition kind of
Now,
thing.
for those that don't know, he's a drummer for Voivod. He did all the Voivod album covers, right? Plus a lot of other different...
Yeah, and a lot of other bands and a lot of stuff that's previously unpublished. There's something like 500 drawings in there.
Right. Will be similar to the Derek Riggs book you did? And
Exactly.
All right.
Yeah, full color throughout, same dimensions, just a big, sweet-looking art book.
Very cool, very cool. And, of course, you can check out his site at martinpopoff.com, and you could order all his books from that site, and you could also check out that sexy picture of you scarfing down those baby back ribs. Is that what that is?
Absolutely. You bet.
And we got Wendell Neeley, the great Wendell Neeley, the man among men, founder and co-host of my favorite radio show and podcast, The Classic Metal Show, which is no surprise. I've said that many a times. You can check that out at theclassicmetalshow.com. You went solo, Neeley, last week on your show. Huh?
Yeah, we took a little midsummer break. I took a couple days out to go hang out with my friends in Dokken. Wait
a second. We got to play that bumper. Oh, shit, I don't have it. Neeley talks about Dokken. All right, well, I'm sure we'll be playing that many times throughout this podcast. So go ahead.
Sure. And, of course, Chris went solo this past week because I was out doing the Dokken thing, and the week before I went solo because Chris was doing a thing. So the fans did not want a pre-recorded show with us doing our normal shtick. They instead opted for us to do solo shows. And,
you know why? Because they hated the one we did with Joel. They said, none more of this pre-recorded bullshit.
So they got what they got. The fans love the live shows.
Well, cool. Well, this coming Saturday, you guys are going to be back in full force, the two of you together, right?
That's right. We'll be back doing our same thing, picking on rock stars and whatnot. In fact, by the time this airs, you're going to find out that Ace Frehley's people turned us down because they did not enjoy our goofing on Ace Frehley demos 2 years ago.
Dude, that was one of the best episodes.
Right. Well, the publicist contacted us and said, we are canceling our interview because of your goofing on the demos. So that's it.
And our third guest, the great David Ellefson, another Skull Sessions regular here. David, of course, one of the original members of the legendary thrash band Megadeth, and currently with F5, Temple of Brutality, Iron Steel. What other projects you got going on, David?
Too many to name right here. Probably the main one that I'm actually is getting ready to go over and do another tour of Europe with Hail, which is my little all-star band I put together with Andreas Kisser from Sepultura, Tim Ripper Owens, and on this one we're going to have Roy Mayorga from Stone Sour jump in on drums. So that's kind of our fun ode to metal, get to throw something back for the fans band.
Hail and kill, right, Neeley?
That's right, Bob. Hail and kill.
Well, first we kill, then hail.
Right.
It's easier to hail after you've killed.
you might have to switch your logo or whatever around there.
Yeah, exactly. Plus, we don't want copyright infringement, so
right.
There you go.
So it isn't like a revolving band. You do all cover songs, or all I guess, say, songs of the bands that you guys are involved with.
Yeah, and, the whole idea of it was, I mean, nobody wants to just be, I don't think we just be in some cover band and just play a bunch of schlocky covered songs, but the idea of it was, a sort of metal gathering of, famous guys playing songs, obviously a couple from our own catalogs, but also just playing some things that we liked growing up, like songs that got us excited to be in bands when we were kids, which would be everything from, early Iron Maiden to, early, I don't know, I'm trying to think of what our set list is. Heaven and Hell, Black Sabbath, technically, early songs like that got everybody excited, and it's cool. We got a pretty slamming set list, man. It's a good night out. Everybody has fun, and you get to be in a band, for all the right reasons. I like to think, no one's no one's hung up on all the stuff that happens in a lot of bands. And, you know, it's a thing that we do it really on our off time when everybody's got the time to do it. And we get to go to the far reaches of the planet to play, which is also makes it exciting.
Awesome. Well, hopefully you'll be coming down to California and the States doing some stuff.
Well, yeah, I know. You know, everybody asks us to play Tour America, and it's the thing we're finding. You know, we've been to Chile, Southern Europe. Now we're going to do this extensive Scandinavia run, and it's, you know, it's cool to go to these places where they don't just get every band, you know, that goes on tour, right. Because, you know, to them it's kind of like they get, you know, again, this kind of all-star, you know, bunch of guys, and we try to do meet and greets afterwards and hang out with the fans, and, you know, really again do it for the fans in these up close and personal settings that most of us haven't done in many, many years.
All right. Well, let's get right into it, guys. The grunge versus, I guess it'll be a long-going debate, grunge versus 80s rock and metal. Of course, we're going to, as I said, broaden it a bit to grunge and alternative rock and metal. We'll start by getting you guys' views. As I said, the reason I picked this panel, I know all of you guys have a vast musical taste in metal music, you know, the thrash metal to the 80s rock to whatever with the cast I've got here. So let's start with you, Neeley. You are basically a big fan of the 80s and hair metal scene. What's your views on grunge?
Well, Bob, one of the things that disappointed me about that whole grunge scene was the absence of, you know, guitars and good vocal. Those were the two main things that I noticed that were missing right away. I was a, you know, big fan of Metallica and Megadeth and like I mentioned, Dokken and, you know, all the guitar-driven vocal type bands of the 80s, and with the 90s grunge movement, it seemed like we basically got complaint rock. Just the vocalists really didn't sing now, did they? Or did they just kind of speak the lyrics in a rhythmic way? You know, more or less complaint rock, if you will, and no virtuoso soloing. So that was a big downer for me. I could say that probably the band in the grunge area that I actually enjoyed was Alice in Chains. So that's my statement.
All right. Well, Martin, you have kind of a different outlook on it. What did you feel when grunge first hit in the early 90s?
Well, I just loved it. I mean, I felt totally excited by music again. I mean, I'm 46 years old. I mean, for me to get excited about a whole movement, it happens a little bit over time, a few times, and when you're a crazy music fan, it's great to have that happen. It probably doesn't even happen to not crazy music fans. So here I was, you know, 30-something, and just loving all this stuff that was coming out. It kicked off for me by seeing Mudhoney live in a small bar in Vancouver, and I was just blown away. Green River, Mudhoney, you know, I disagree a little bit with you there, Neeley, on guitars. I mean, it was wall-to-wall guitars. There might not have been guitar solos, but there was new, fresh, inventive, dangerous riffing. You know, I was a punk fan from the late 70s as well, so I loved that it was dangerous and dirty again. You'd get EPs, you'd get songs where they weren't in any big hurry to you know, impress you. They would do exactly kind of what they wanted. It was very artistic and creative and wild. And I thought the vocalists were great. You have Chris Cornell. I thought Kurt Cobain had an amazing, cool, roaring, melodic voice. Lane Staley was a totally different vocalist, but a cool one. Mark Arm from Mudhoney was a cool vocalist. And yeah, you had time signatures, and sure, it was complaint rock. That's true, and that is one of the big things that people put it down for. But still, you know, I was ready to hear some good deep lyrics again after 80s metal lyrics. So I just love the way that it almost did what punk was supposed to do, which was clean house of the dinosaurs, and it never did it because the dinosaurs ruled. They continued to rule. Punk was just a blip. Grunge actually did do that. I mean, there were just classic albums coming out of the big 4 or 5 grunge bands, to draw a comparison with the big thrash bands, with Dave being there. But you know, the grunge had their big bands, and they were all multi-platinum artists and making amazing records. So I was absolutely, you know, happy for, you know, probably right now, out of my top 100 albums from all time, there'd probably be 12 or 15 grunge albums in there, or maybe at least 10. I just thought it was an amazing movement with music done for all the right artistic, creative reasons, and heavy as hell.
All right. And to David, you, of course, were playing with Megadeth at the time throughout the 90s, particularly when grunge exploded in the early, mid-90s. I mean, Megadeth were at their peak with, Rust in Peace, Countdown to Extinction, Euthanasia. It obviously didn't affect Megadeth the way it affected a lot of the other 80s, like the hair metal bands. But Megadeth, as I mentioned earlier, was very, very instrumental in bringing out a lot of these grunge bands and helping these bands basically get noticed. Not just grunge bands, I mean, from alternative bands from Korn and STP to Soundgarden and, of course, Alice in Chains on the Clash of the Titans tour. Megadeth was the first band to bring these bands out on their very first tours.
Sounds like it's our fault then, huh?
It's all your fault.
Well, artistically it was a double-edged sword because I agree with what Martin just said. I liked a lot of grunge music. I liked especially that it was this, it really did make the impact that punk rock never was able to do. And I was a big fan of punk, of, the Sex Pistols, the Ramones, the Dead Boys, and all that stuff coming out of New York. When I was a kid, those were my formative years. I had just come out of being a Kiss fan at age 12, and by 15 I was getting into punk. And then, of course, at 18, 19 is when I moved to California. We got our thing rolling, and off we went. But, the double-edged sword was that as much as when I heard, the Nirvana Nevermind album on the radio in L.A., where I was living in 1990, well, I don't know, when was that? 91, I guess, 92 maybe. And we were on our Countdown to Extinction album, and I thought, wow, this is cool, man. This is, I was definitely sick of the hair band singers and sick of everything that was going on at that time. We just needed a big old, enema house cleaning, of what was happening musically at that time, I thought. Now, the double-edged sword is that then 2 years later, when we were doing the Euthanasia record, Pearl Jam, Nirvana, the movement as we know it was getting very popular, and our glory days at MTV were certainly over like overnight. And it was because MTV jumped all over the grunge thing. And I remember we had submitted Train of Consequences as the first single from Euthanasia, which was received fairly well. We did the Night of Living Megadeth or something show that we did on Halloween on MTV at the Ritz in New York. And then we tried to submit the Atula Mon video, and they just would not have it. They wouldn't take it. We said we could change whatever we need to do. If there's some content, they said, no, we just won't take it. And that was really the end of the ride on MTV for us. And it wasn't just us. In fact, the only metal band that survived that was Metallica, because they were so big that it was just undeniable. I mean, if you're going to throw Metallica off MTV, you'd scream foul play. But for everybody else, Queensryche, whoever else it may have been that was really, kind of a staple at that point, even on Headbangers Ball and all that. I mean, all those bands, the whole format, the programming changed, and everything, and that really affected everybody's careers big time, and so that's just kind of the business side of it as well. So, and I think for, you're right, Bob, that to a large degree, we always took out acts that were relevant, up-and-comers, tried to help support the scene by, like you said, Alice in Chains, Korn, STP, and a lot of groups like that were, the modern up-and-coming bands at the time who, quite frankly, went on to sell more records than we did even, some of them. And so, for me, grunge, when you called me on this, I was like, how ironic, because it really was, it was a double-edged sword that we liked it, or I liked it, we supported it, yet at the same time, it ultimately was like a boomerang that came around and it took a few swings at us.
Well, as far as I'm concerned, I agree with all of you on certain points. I mean, when grunge first hit, I mean, obviously I was living in L.A. at the time, and I was a big fan of all types of metal music, very open-minded to new music. And I thought, like Martin, I thought when it first hit, I thought it was refreshing as hell. Was never huge into the Nirvana, but I remember seeing Soundgarden at their very first shows during the Foundation's form, and my friend was a fan of theirs before Loud Love, and I played me some of the earlier stuff, which I didn't care for too much. But when I got Loud Love and I saw them, my first show I saw them at Foundation's form, I think in front of like 30 people, and I was just going, this is fucking great. And I think at that point, thrash was going strong, but the whole 80s metal scene needed a fucking kick in the ass, especially with the hair bands. I mean, I'm a fan of a lot of that stuff, but it just got completely silly when you got to bands like, the Wingers, Firehouse, Danger Danger, and it was getting so formulated. Same ballads, same stuff, Slaughter, all that stuff, Warrant. It just got ridiculous. And I think kind of like when punk came in, it was kind of refreshing. It was starting in the 70s. You had your commercial bands like the Foreigners, Styx, and all those, REO Speedwagon, all those radio-friendly bands. And then you had your real proggy bands that did, these self-indulgent kind of, 20-minute songs and whatnot. So I kind of looked at grunge the same way. I think the music scene, especially the rock and roll scene, needed a great kick in the ass. But I think the grunge scene was way overrated. I think it was almost like a novelty. It was great. The attitude was great. It was exciting. It was refreshing. But then it just got way exploited and became a complete trend. Now, David, you had mentioned how it affected some bands apart from, Metallica. But, of course, come the late 90s when not just grunge but alternative music was at its height. Of course, Metallica did change their sound during the Load records, whether people like it or not. And Megadeth, too, kind of in a different way with Cryptic Writings, which I absolutely love, actually. I love that album, as well as Risk. But I was more in a commercial vein. And a lot of the other original thrash bands, Slayer changed their sound, Suicidal, Anthrax to an extent. So it did kind of affect the thrash scene. Was that due to the grunge and the alternative scene that you think not just Megadeth, but some of the other thrash bands that kind of altered their sounds?
Well, I think to some degree you're going to be influenced by what goes on around you. You hang out in the barbershop long enough, you're going to get your hair cut, so to speak. And both literally and figuratively, I guess, thinking about it. But and I don't think so much even just artistically as much as even just what all is happening around you on every level in your life as an artist, you're working in an industry that's around you. I think also in the albums you referenced there, Cryptic Writings and I guess Risk to some degree, bands also grow and develop. And I think that those records, and probably Load for Metallica, those records were all at a point in our careers where, we had gone to some pretty big heights and done things. And, eventually everybody starts to stretch their wings a little bit, for better, usually for worse, unfortunately, because I think that's the thing with metal music is that the window's pretty small of what the fans like, and that's what they want to hear. They come to you because that is exactly what they want. And once you start going too far outside that box, the fans get pissed or they just flat out leave. So I don't think, at least on our side of it, I don't think there was an intentional desire to chase after what was happening. I think that those records were probably more of just kind of just wanting to spread our wings and just develop a little bit more and see, what else was out there for us to explore as, artistically. Really, that's my thought on it.
Well, something that you had said when with MTV and everything changing, that was something that really bothered the hell out of me. It really showed at that point how corporate these record labels are and how they really treated bands as if they were a commodity. It wasn't about developing bands anymore. It was about chasing this new trend. I was at Roadrunner Records at the time, and Martin and I had talked about this. The band Last Crack, they did their second album, Burning Time. Great album. Dave Jordan produced it. I remember calling the radio stations, calling all the press people, trying to get some kind of reaction out of them to play up. They would have nothing to do with it. I would bring up Dave Jordan, who produced Alice in Chains and Jane's Addiction. That would get their attention. They'd ask, is the band from Seattle? I'm like, no, they're from Wisconsin, actually. Oh, well, are they grunge? No, not exactly. Well, it's all right. We don't want anything to do with it. I'll give it a listen, but if it's not grunge, to be honest, and I got that reaction from everyone, from the press to the radio people, and I'm thinking, what kind of fucking bullshit is this? It became a complete trend where it just became this monopoly, and I think it was fueled by the record companies, obviously, because they were putting so much money behind it, and that's something I want to get into. They say how much grunge was an underground movement, but I'll tell you, there was more money spent on supporting and promoting these bands in the entire 80s hair metal movement. But that's what really bugged me. Now, I know, Neeley, you're a big fan, obviously, of the 80s rock, bands like Dokken and that kind of stuff. I know you're close with a lot of these bands, and it pretty much immediately these bands out of the map. What was your feeling about that?
Well, obviously, the media has a lot to do with popularity of bands. That was one of the things that I wanted to bring up when you were mentioning how the grunge scene exploded. And I guess one of the questions I've always had is, did the grunge scene explode because the music was so good? Or that's what the media was saying, this is what you should be listening to. And people jump on bandwagons and they go, oh, well, this is what's happening. This is what's cool. This is what's hip. This is what's now. Whether they really enjoyed it or not, it's just like, oh, well, everybody's listening to this, so this must be the thing to do. And so that being that, we mentioned MTV, which basically is non-existent anymore, but back then, they were supporting that. That was one of the main outlets of finding out who's hot, who's hip, what's going on out there in the rock world. And of course, commercial radio at the time used to be a force, and they were playing that. They switched their formats from, classic rock or 80s rock to the grunge stuff. Everybody was going to becoming the alternative station. Everybody went away from the format of hard melodic rock to your alternative station, and that's what they featured was Nirvana and Pearl Jam and Soundgarden and Smashing Pumpkins and so on and so forth. So I always question, was grunge big because it was so good, or was it big because everybody just bought into the hype? As far as, my thought on the way it, pushed what I consider hard melodic rock or metal, underground, it never went away. Dave is a testament to that. Megadeth never went away. They didn't suffer from that. They just kept plodding on, and the true diehard fans, they were always there to support them. And the bandwagon jumpers, well, they were no longer at the show. So the attendance at these shows dwindled down. But thank goodness some bands just stuck it out and plodded on, even though a few of them attempted to modernize their sound, if you will. You mentioned Warrant earlier with their Belly to Belly and their ultraphobic, and Dokken with their Shadow Life, and a few of those bands attempted the grunge sound but failed miserably. So that just goes to show you, even though they attempted to have the same sound as all the other bands, they failed miserably because that's not what they were known for.
Hey, you know what? I want to make a comment on it because I think that's a good point that you bring up is, you look at some things and, sometimes if you throw enough money at something, you can make it successful and you can even, buy success, so to speak. But with grunge, and a perfect example is that if everybody's jumping on the bandwagon, and just from what I saw living in Los Angeles at that time, which obviously is very media driven and at that time was the hub of the record industry to a large degree, the grunge thing started to really just take on a life of its own. And I think there's a reason everybody started drinking it. It's, going after it. It brings to mind drinking Coke or Pepsi, and which one is preferred. And to some degree, eventually, of course, everybody just started switching and changing over. And like you said, but radio stations change formats because they know that's what their listeners want to listen to. They know that's where the money is and all the rest of that stuff. So I think you bring up a good point. It's kind of like when the chick rock thing got big, with the Lilith Fair, Sheryl Crow, Sarah McLachlan, all that stuff. All of a sudden there for a while, that was that whole girl singer-songwriter thing was a big trend that happened, and it obviously was popular because people really liked it. They were into it. Probably none of us on this phone line were, but
I hate it.
but for the most part, it was. And again, you go back and reference Metallica. I mean, Metallica, did they buy their success? No. I mean, that was just a phenomenon that happened. It was unexplainable, and to some degree, from where I stood at that point in the world, that's where Nirvana, Pearl Jam, that whole movement. And I would agree, Alice in Chains is probably the one Seattle sort of quasi grunge band that us metalheads liked, because they had more of a metal tendency to them. But that whole thing, I think it happened because that's just the world. That's what the world was really wanting at that time.
I think it happened for the right reasons. I think it was exciting, really good music. One thing that's kind of interesting with grunge is that it was easy for the corporate end of things to wrap their head around. It was easy for the media to wrap their head around because you had photography that was black and white and blurry. You had one label to sort of deal with early on, Sub Pop. It was all in Seattle. They had a uniform. You could define it pretty quickly as dirty, decadent, dangerous metal with a punk edge. It was just very easy to figure out exactly what everybody was talking about. You quickly had a label, grunge, perfect label. It was just like this great, much better than problematic labels like new metal, like when does metal stop being new, or power metal. Why is, ballerina frilly sleeves metal the most powerful metal in the world, right? There's all these names that don't make any sense. Grunge makes perfect sense right off the bat. So the corporate end of things, yes, they jumped on it pretty quickly, and I guess if you wanted to nail down where it came from, it would have been Pearl Jam 10 and the second Nirvana album. But let's not put Nirvana down too much for that album, because the first album is heavy and grinding as hell, and even the third album was that way. I mean, they had, for all their getting onto major labels and selling all these records, they really did have a lot of, good ethics about not wanting to make commercial music. I mean, they constantly were challenging their fans with not commercial music. I mean, look at what Pearl Jam's done over all these albums. They've been obstinate about, being who they are, and they're still, an arena act. Even though they can't sell as many records. I mean, they just kind of don't care. So I think it all happened for the right reason. It was good music, but we're all right in that it really dealt a blow to metal. One other final point I want to make is, we talk about how hair metal, we needed a house cleaning of hair metal. Thrash was getting pretty derivative too. I mean, everything that seemed to be coming out on Under One Flag in the UK, all these, UK never could put up good thrash bands, and they were coming faster and quicker. It's like enough already.
And
right?
Even Epic, I remember CBS and Epic, they had their own metal department, and they were just spewing out just shitty thrash bands just to hop on the trend too.
Yeah.
Well, what's funny with that? It's kind of like Clash of the Titans was like the handing off of the torch, because I totally agree with you, Martin. It's like thrash fell victim to the same thing that hair metal and what every label did after Guns N' Roses came out. Everybody wanted to have one of those bands. When Poison came out, everybody wanted a glam band. When thrash metal came out, there was a handful of us, and then every major label wanted to go out and try to get one of those. So you're right. You exploit it to the point that it's not cool, it's not hip, it's not any of that. So it's funny that, with the three of us, on Clash of the Titans, that then we bring out Alice in Chains as the lowly little opening band who got booed and, shit thrown at them all the time or from time to time because the metal fans weren't into it. But yet, ironically, I knew very well, it was just so clear to me on that tour, that was the pinnacle of thrash metal. That was as big as it was going to get. And I quite honestly haven't seen anything even get to that level since, where it was really selling out arenas, but it took the combined efforts of three bands. But then after that, we all kind of went off in our different directions, and kind of the thrash scene really disjointed and kind of unplugged as a united force. But the baton was handed over to Alice in Chains, and then that chapter was written. Fortunately, the worst part of it was it gave license for chicks to dress ugly at rock concerts after that, but whatever.
Exactly.
That's a whole other story. But, again, the difference with thrash and grunge, I mean, everyone says how grunge was such an underground movement. Look at thrash metal, David, I was there from the beginning. I saw the very first Metallica shows, the first Megadeth shows. We did the first interview. Check out the Shockwaves Hard Radio interview with David Ellefson back in 1984 on that one. But we did all the old...
shameless plug right there, that one was.
You like that, huh?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah.
The difference there, thrash really did come from the underground and got absolutely no support. There were no clubs that wanted anything to do with it. And if it wasn't for the fanzines like the ones I did or Metal Mania or, some of these others out there, thrash metal would not have gotten their start. I mean, it was basically up to the underground demo traders and the fanzines that exposed them. Radio play wasn't playing. I mean, look, it took Metallica to sell 3-4 million records when Injustice for All came out to finally get on the radio and MTV. You know what I'm saying? It wasn't supported like grunge. Grunge wasn't an instant support. It was like a total changeover. A couple of these bands obviously did independent records, like you said, Nirvana and Soundgarden. But it was something that not only the labels, but the labels, the press, the radio, they just hopped on it like a bandwagon. That didn't happen with thrash metal. Thrash metal had to battle it out for years in the underground before it proved itself. Metallica proved itself on its own. So did Megadeth. So did Slayer. All totally independently. And then after they were selling, a couple 100,000 records, then finally the media and the corporate labels and, a press and everything, finally that's when they started to catch on it. But grunge was more of a planned strategy, I think, from the beginning. And the thing that bugs me again is that it was so exclusive to, if it's not grunge, we're not going to support it. And Martin, you got to agree with that point. We did a podcast earlier about your 90s. What's the book called again, Martin? The
Collector's Guide to Heavy Metal, Volume 3, the 90s. Yeah.
That's right. There were so many great bands that released albums in the 90s that were completely overlooked. And I'll go with Martin, which I don't particularly think it was a great album as Martin thinks, but you put the Love Hate, their second record, as your number one favorite record. Now, you got to admit, when that album came out, I mean, the first album came out on the heels of Guns N' Roses before the grunge scene hit, and Blackout in the Red Room, I think it was called. It got a pretty good buzz, but when their second record came out, which you think is one of the greatest albums ever recorded, nobody did anything to support it, including their label, including all the press. I mean, that's my...
You're right. You're right, Bob. I mean, number one, though, yes, you're right. It was over for those kinds of bands, but the reason that record is so good is because they are getting inspired by this smarter music that is kicking everybody's butt. And, you put a band like Soundgarden on the planet, and everybody has to raise their game. And that second Love Hate album is a perfect example of that. And if you're bringing up that there is all this great metal being released that is being ignored through the 90s, well, I would almost argue, I'm only coming to this realization right now and it's coming off the top of my head, but I would argue that a lot of the great metal that came out in the 90s, like say that Last Crack Burning Time, was absolutely inspired by the great, complicated, creative metal that these grunge bands were, and some of the satellite bands, people getting inspiration from the Pixies and Jane's Addiction, and maybe Smashing Pumpkins a little, and Paw was a great grunge band from Lawrence, Kansas, and Melvins, and little industrial noisy things that were happening out of Chicago or whatever. So if there was great metal in the 90s, I really think grunge deserves some of the credit for that, in that they are, I'm not saying that these were those failed experiments that we all kind of look at the Warrant album, the Dokken album, all these records that came out on Cheese Metal Cemetery at exactly the same time, right? I'm not talking about those experiments, but I'm talking more like the Last Crack Burning Times. Or that Love Hate album, for lack of a better. I mean, that's like 1992 or whatever. And yeah, that is one of my favorite albums of all time. I think that thing just went over everybody's head, but it was a really smart record because those guys were being inspired now not by Guns N' Roses, but by really smart music going on around.
You know what? I'm going to argue that, and because that's my position here. I think it was, pre-grunge. I mean, you mentioned Alice in Chains. I mean, you mentioned Jane's Addiction. I grew up in L.A., and I was there when thrash hit. I was there pre-grunge, so I remember before grunge, there was a lot of bands, particularly a band called St. Vitus, who were an L.A. underground band, who I think Soundgarden got a lot of their sound. In fact, when I first heard Soundgarden and saw them, I'm thinking, well, reminds me of like St. Vitus. They had that Sabbath overtones, but they had a little bit more of a punk, grungy, I guess, kind of edge to it. But I remember getting all these bands. I had a band signed to Enigma in the mid-'80s, and I knew all the people from Enigma and Green World. And, I was checking out bands like Jane's Addiction, Firehose, not Firehouse, Gene Loves Jezebel, all these bands that played like the Scream Club and all that. The attitude was the same as grunge. The fans looked the same and dressed the same. same kind of image. Grunge was a little bit obviously darker and, heavier to an extent. But let's face it, Seattle before grunge had a whole life of its own. I mean, everyone thinks that grunge started with Seattle metal, but of course you had, Queensryche, you had Metal Church, you had TKO, you had Wild Dogs, you had Culprit. There were a lot of regular metal bands coming out of Seattle. I think a lot of the Seattle bands got influenced from the L.A. underground scene. So,
Bob, that's a really good point, because I tell you, you remember back in there was a point where it was like, if you didn't live in Hollywood or in L.A. or maybe in New York, if you didn't live where the music industry was, you didn't get in the game. It just was that simple. I mean, I had to move there. So I know from experience I had to move halfway across the country to get there. But, back in until grunge, when I will say to its credit, one of the things it did is it got lazy A&R guys off their ass and out of the office to go discover, like, wow, there is other music outside of the Sunset Strip or, what's happening down the street, in the clubs down in the Village, in New York or you know what I mean? And so in Seattle, that movement that happened in the early 90s definitely forced people to start looking outside. I mean, all of a sudden bands were popping up in the Midwest, and there was bands in Minnesota and Texas and, all over the country, which I think was a healthy thing for everybody to start thinking outside of the box.
I agree. I mean, there were definitely some positive points for it, and again, when the scene first started, I'm not opposed to it. I think it gave the industry and the music scene a good kick in the ass, which it needed at the time. Just like when punk came out in the late '70s, I think it was a very similar thing. But my point is, people just took it overboard. Was grunge really that good? Was it really that influential? And that's my deal. Is I think grunge was helped heavily by the metal scene. I mean, I already talked about bands like Megadeth and even Pantera. Alice in Chains' first tour was opening for Pantera. I remember seeing Soundgarden at the Jezebel's nightclub playing with Voivod and Prong. I mean, which was a great tour. All these metal bands were the bands that took out the grunge bands when they first started. It was the pure rock metal stations like the KNACs in Los Angeles that were the first to play bands like Alice in Chains, Soundgarden, Pearl Jam, Stone Temple Pilots, even bands like White Zombie, Tool, Rage Against the Machine, Faith No More, Bush, Candlebox. They were playing these bands long before any of the alternative or modern rock stations like KROQ were playing them. And it was the publications like RIP and Hit Parader that were the first to cover these bands, way before Spin or Rolling Stone. These bands were first featured on MTV on Headbangers Ball, not 120 Minutes, the alternative show. And so basically grunge was really riding on the heels of metal music. But once grunge started gaining traction and popularity, both grunge and the alternative music, once it started to become hip, they completely blew off all the metal bands, all the metal sources that helped them to get their start, and they completely disassociated themselves from anything that had to do with metal back then. So, what are your views on that, Neeley?
Well, I got to tell you, Bob, the Classic Metal Show is going to be celebrating its 14th anniversary this year. And the reason why the Classic Metal Show was even established was I was sick and tired of grunge. I was at the time I was driving a truck as a living and listened to a lot of radio, and I was so tired of not being able to hear on the radio what I wanted to listen to because I wasn't hearing anything other than alternative on the radio. That's all I was hearing. And I thought to myself, you know what, I'm going to do something about this personally. So I got off the road, went to broadcasting school, got into commercial radio. I found a small commercial radio that allowed me to start the Classic Metal Show in January of '96. And with technology being what it is and advances, the Classic Metal Show is a worldwide phenomenon. There's not too many people who listen to metal who haven't heard about the Classic Metal Show in one shape or another. We're all over Brave Words, we're all over Blabbermouth, we're all over Melodic Rock, Metal Leader, all the metal news. We've interviewed all the biggest names in the world of metal, and we're still going strong. So I can thank the grunge movement for the establishing the classic metal show. So that's my salute to grunge.
But but when we're talking about grunge, see, part of the problem is, and grunge really deserves this, and this is why it upsets a bunch of, old metalheads like us, is that, basically grunge as a metal movement. I mean, everything, Bob, that you just said is, that was a great sort of look at the history of how it came in. And that also proves that grunge was a type of metal in the beginning. Metal stations, metal bands were all starved for this new type of metal. But I guess what happened eventually is that because it was so creative and wayward and the rules were there to be broken, just like Queen and Led Zeppelin in the old days. I mean, basically because this was a very creative thing. Pearl Jam was almost like the gateway that, hey, you don't have to be a heavy metal band. So I guess what happened very quickly with grunge is it did become a form of just mainstream hard guitarish rock. And I guess, we should even put a little side asterisk and thank grunge for the fact that the guitar didn't go away. I mean, all these debates everybody's had since probably about 1970 is that, when are robots and electronics going to take over and there's going to be no more guitars at all, right? Look what happened. I mean, all through the 90s, I mean, there was all this pretty darn heavy music that, we could look at a poppy grunge band from 1997, and if you took that back to 1977, you'd say, damn, that's some heavy stuff. So we all got pretty inured or immune to actually how heavy things kind of kept going. But I guess very quickly grunge became hard alternative, and then maybe it was just alternative. So, Neeley, you're right. After a while, it really rankled the heavy metal in all of us because really it dissipated very quickly and became, a whole bunch of grunge light bands, and Alice in Chains broke up, Soundgarden broke up, Nirvana broke up with a bang, Pearl Jam kept going, but, and all those little baby bands like My Sister's Machine and Grunt Truck, and there were some good, pretty heavy bands, but they were already derivative and late. None of them lasted. Paul was gone pretty quickly. So all of a sudden, I think what we're talking about and complaining about here is alternative or hard alternative or grunge light, and it's no longer the grunge that we should all love from, 1990.
Yeah. No, I think Martin, you bring up a good point just speaking about music because you're right. I mean, in the 80s, there was a certain production value. You go back and you listen to, Warrant, Dokken Records. There's this big washed out snare drum sound. It was the arena rock, hairband cock rock sound. It was a production that was there. And even in, I remember standing many times in the band room as we're writing songs, and all of a sudden you get to the, okay, you've done a verse, a chorus, now it's the obligatory guitar solo, And after a while, I was like, why does it have to friggin' be a solo in every song? Why does it have to be there? And one thing that I admired about, I won't say alternative, but especially Nirvana, even if it was just for an album, that somebody's doing like, okay, we're not going to play guitar solo, we're going to do kind of this musical break and then bring it back around to the next verse or the chorus again, And I guess in particular reference like Teen Spirit after where it goes to what would normally be a solo, there's just kind of this musical thing happening that is not a solo. It's not a self-indulgent wank. And me personally, even just as a player, I thought that was inventive. It was different. Somebody came up with a new way to write a tune and be outside of the box, because every single, whether it was a Whitesnake song or it was one of our songs, it's like they always went to the obligatory guitar solo, and after a while it was almost like you fell victim of your own template of how to write songs. And, so again, even if it was just for a short period, that changed. Of course, what got annoying is then everybody started kind of hanging these octave chords, which new metal, that's what then it was almost like, okay, well, definitely don't play a solo. And I think that's where this whole shred movement has come back here in recent years. But, which, I admire because at least people grew up going, hey, man, I really want to shred and I want to play guitar, and I get all that too. But, there's this thing about, the whole shred thing can just get self-indulgent as well. And I don't know. I always liked when there was a purpose for why everything happened in a song.
Well, definitely movements like grunge are very important in rock and roll, just as punk was, like I said, back in the late 70s, because it was getting very self-indulgent. And it does take a new form to kind of kick it in the ass. But, again, we're bands like the Ramones, the greatest rock band in the world, as Rolling Stone or Spin would say. No, it was like a novelty thing. They were a fun band. They were good for when it came out, but they're not great. They're not classic bands like Sabbath, Purple, Zeppelin, Judas Priest, UFO, or AC/DC. I don't even think they come close. And I think the same thing with grunge. I think there were some real good songs, some strong songs. Was it terribly original? I don't think so. Not for what, like I said, I think there were bands in L.A. prior to that I've personally seen live that were doing the same kind of things. I think a lot of the bands from the new wave of British heavy metal were doing a lot of the grungy kind of stuff, back in the early 80s, as well as, a lot of the punk, so-called punk bands from back then. So, I think grunge took a little bit from all these different aspects and they made it basically into a trend. But my point is there was one band that I feel single-handedly invented the whole grunge movement. Trickster. I mean, come on. They were the first band to wear flannel. Look at those early MTV videos.
I was thinking, the Ramones were surf rock with a leather jacket, so I'm trying to think who played surf rock with a flannel shirt on. I couldn't think of one.
If it wasn't for Trickster, there would be no grunge image. So there you go.
Well,
I think you've truly lost your mind now.
Yeah.
I was going to say I knew thrash metal was in trouble when I saw Dave Mustaine showing up in his flannel shirt just about every interview I seen him on MTV.
Hey, I'm guilty of that myself, so,
I used to wear flannel before.
We were on the cover of Burn magazine in our flannels, and people laugh at it, and I was like, I don't know, I thought it felt kind of comfortable myself, but that's because I grew up in Minnesota, and Paul Bunyan was our state hero, so I could get away with it,
Yeah.
There you go.
But, hey, on a serious note, I mean, that's kind of, again, was the same thing, and it was the same thing with punk. It was a healthy thing. They were just going to show up and wear whatever they were wearing, and hey, this stuff's comfortable. That's why we're wearing it. That's why we're in hiking boots. We're in Seattle. It rains all the time.
Well, it's funny that you say that because, when you think about any big phenomenon, it's a lifestyle, isn't it? It isn't just the music, because it's easy for us as, like, metalheads to just only talk about the music and the chord changes and whether they played a solo or not. But when you really think about, anything, I mean, look, when Iron Maiden came out in the new wave of British heavy metal, it was, skinny jeans, white high tops, and leather bike jackets. I mean, that was the move. That was the uniform of the scene, and then when grunge came out, it was the flannel, like you say, hiking boots, Doc Martens, that was it. I mean, to the degree that, Macy's and Dillard's started carrying those kind of clothes because that's what their customers wanted. And just kind of like now with the whole emo and emo core thing, Hot Topic is, thriving because of, the same kind of thing. So, well, it's like when it eventually ends up in the mall, it's more than just, that at that point it becomes a phenomenon.
It's called mall rock.
Mall rock, yeah, exactly. Which, unfortunately, is what a lot of thrash metal is now, too. I mean, there's a couple of good thrash bands that I admire, Lamb of God and a few of them, but, to some degree, even that's kind of the mall version of, not Lamb of God, but with the scene that has it. It's, now a lot of things come around because things obviously come full circle, but even some of that is just, it's like mall thrash, it's not even the real deal. It's kind of the people growing up wanting to imitate it, and I give them credit because I'm thrilled that they're inspired by it and they're doing their version of it. But Bob, you brought up an interesting point early on that a lot of the alternative artists that went on to some big success grew up on thrash music, and I got to say, I always thought it was cool that if they might have grown up on Rust in Peace or Peace Cells or Master of Puppets or something, that they at least, when they got the guitar in their hand and it was their turn up to bat, they didn't just do what we did. They went off and did something and created and contributed something to the world through what they did. And I think that that's cool, and I give them a lot of credit for that.
Yeah, but a lot of the grunge bands never really, particularly in the mid to late 90s when metal was, really dying out, they never gave props to the metal bands. Never. You would hear in interviews or anything, totally disassociated themselves from metal, whereas a lot of the newer bands, you know, the Lamb of Gods, even a lot of the, so to speak, emo bands or whatever, they'll flat out say, hey, you know, I was influenced by Slayer and, you know, Megadeth and Metallica and Iron Maiden and stuff like that. Grunge bands never say. Now some of the grunge bands are obviously saying it because, you know, metal's, you know, once again hip again, but when metal was down and out, man, nobody was admitting to even owning an Iron Maiden record, let alone talk about them. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, that's very interesting, and I wonder if they are being insincere about that. It would be good to go back and revisit all of them and find that out. But I mean, I think there was probably a certain anger and you know, will to want to disassociate from the very recent metal, but we all know that you know, they were definitely influenced by heavy classic rock from the 70s, Sabbath and Zeppelin and punk. I mean, grunge was as good as it was because it had very complicated roots. I mean, nobody had more complicated musical taste than Kurt Cobain. I mean, he was just all over the board with totally obscure stuff, and then it was Aerosmith and Led Zeppelin, you know, at the same time. Crazy, weird punk, avant-garde punk, normal, heavy punk, which is, you know, closest thing to what Nirvana sounded like. But, you know, and I think that it is kind of disconcerting, and possibly they're being a little whatever the word is of that, because you got to imagine Metallica and Megadeth had something to do with it, because they were 14, 15, 16, right when, you know, those great early thrash albums were coming out, and you got to think that they were into those albums as well. So, you know, and you never heard new wave of British heavy metal. My God, you never heard any of that stuff out of them. But yeah, you're right. It was usually punk, and you wonder if they were being a little bit mercenary about only citing hip bands because they were now considered the totally hip bands.
You know, and I thought metal music always did kind of change from, you know, the melodic metal to the progressive metal, and here's a new kind of sound, this kind of grunge metal. And seeing the bands again, you know, when they first started, it was all metal people that showed up. When I first saw Alice in Chains, it was in front of like 50 people at the Palace, and then the next time was at Florentine Gardens, and Pearl Jam opened up, but they were called Mookie Blaylock when their very first time playing in L.A., and the people that were there were the most metal fans. They played on the metal nights. But as grunge progressed, it just got so hypocritical, I think. I mean, I know a lot of people when, you know, bands like Pearl Jam were huge. I had friends tell me that were backstage with Pearl Jam. The band after the show was all giddy and partying and having a good time. And then, like, you know, their publicist or label executive would walk in and say, okay, we got somebody from the LA Times coming in to do an interview. And all of a sudden, the mood would just totally change. You know, it was like, okay, guys, put on your game face. You know, and Eddie Vedder would have this puppy dog face all of a sudden. And then they would just all talk about how miserable life is and everything. It was that real hypocritical kind of thing. And that's I understand they didn't want to be like the 80s, you know, hair bands with a whole backstage groupies and all that. But they just downplayed it to the point where, you know, it was ridiculous. And the fact that they kept saying how they related so much, the grunge bands related to their fans, and they hated that whole rock star image, that was complete bullshit. Because you would never see bands like Pearl Jam or Soundgarden hanging out after the shows like so many of the thrash bands like Megadeth did back in the 80s, you know, talking to fans, signing autographs. I mean, I remember seeing, you know, this famous grunge band, I won't mention who, one of the fans coming up to him when someone introduced him, and he's like, hey, I'm a big fan, blah, 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 and he just like looked at him like, yeah, Not just barely wouldn't even look at him, just completely blew him off. And it's like, fuck you, man. You know, who the fuck do you think you are? And I think they got this kind of this high and mighty attitude, like they're better than everyone else. But the way the press spinned it, it was like, oh, they're so down to earth and they relate to everybody's feelings. Whereas it was really, you know, a lot of the hair bands were pompous and all that, but particularly the thrash bands, they were the ones that really related to the fans being on the same level.
Well, if you make a living by being miserable and you sell 10 million records, you're not going to be miserable anymore, so your career's essentially over.
Well, what do you feel about that, Neeley?
Well, I agree with you, Bob. I think there was a lot of insincerity there. And I agree with what Dave said, is these guys did get successful on their formula, being complaint rockers or whatever, and they acting downtrodden and whatever. And one of the things that I always wondered about Kurt Cobain, obviously Nirvana, spearheaded that whole movement at first, and I'm sure that they had quite a bit of success. I don't know monetarily what Kurt Cobain reaped from the career of Nirvana. But my thought was always, in the interviews that I always read with Kurt Cobain, is how tortured he was and how, miserable he was. And I often thought to myself, then why don't you just drop out of the scene and stop doing it? Just take your money, whatever you made, and quit. Just leave. Go buy a little island somewhere and, get away from everybody if everybody around you makes you so miserable. So I didn't know how much of that was contrived, and Eddie Vedder pontificating and acting so enlightened and so much more, enlightened than your average Joe out there, your Joe Sixpack, and how he pontificated in these deep, emotional Pearl Jam songs, and, they touched the soul, and, he had the answers to the world, and, I didn't buy into any of that stuff. They weren't modern day prophets to me at all. And I agree with you, Bob. I think a lot of it was contrived, and I didn't buy into any of it.
Yeah, I think there was a big backlash. I had a funny story with Nirvana. I was at Roadrunner Records at the time, and this was when Nevermind was just starting to break. Before the band was real popular, again, like I said, Headbangers Ball, even with bands like Nirvana, Headbangers Ball was what gave them their first start. I was at Roadrunner working the Sepultura. This is when Arise came out, and Sepultura was starting to take off, and this was like their big Headbangers Ball interview. It was with Ricky Rackman. And we're in the green room with Kurt Cobain from Nirvana. You might have remembered is when he came out with that yellow dress. And in the green room, he was like passed out. And he looked at us, and I'm there with the Sepultura guys. We're having a good time talking. And he just like completely blew us off and like slammed the door on us. How dare you guys have fun in front of me? And then, he went on and just acted all miserable. And it's like, dude, come on. You're in a rock band for a reason. If you don't like it, as you say, Neeley, quit or do something completely independent like a band like Fugazi or Floggy Molly. But when you're signed with these major labels, and that was the thing that bugged me, because like I said, these bands were as corporate as ever. I know as a fact when, like Michael Goldstone at Epic or Sony or whatever, when he signed Pearl Jam and Rage Against the Machine, I believe he signed Korn too, they already planned that these albums, they would do whatever it takes to make them huge. I mean, I heard Pearl Jam had something like $1 million budget just for radio. So don't tell me that, money wasn't spent on these bands. I mean, the reason I say this is they keep talking about how, like, all the 80s bands were just so corporate and held out for the money. And, no, we're not into the money. We're into the art. That was all bull. At least be honest about it. I don't mind you not doing it, but don't try to make it out like you guys were so artistic and anti-money and anti-rock star when you're pulling off the same bullshit. You remember when, I'm sorry, I'm going off again. But you remember when Alice in Chains was on, when they were on Headbangers Ball with Ricky Rackman, and they were like having a good time. This is why I always liked Alice in Chains. Like in that Pantera video, they were like partying, having a good time. And same within the Alice in Chains Headbangers Ball piece. They were doing a water slide, and Lane Staley was wearing like these Speedos and like being silly and like having fun. And then after that aired, I remember all these grunge fans like all pissed off, like, oh, they're not true grunge. Alice in Chains, did you see them on Headbangers Ball? They were all acting like 80s bands. And I'm like, they were being themselves. They weren't acting like anyone. They're having a good time, It's like, how dare them have fun and, have a good time. You're supposed to be miserable. And it just, at that point, it just got so fucking stupid. I mean, it's like, come on, How phony is this?
That's why we liked Alice in Chains, is because they were more like a metal band. They were more like a long hair metal band. I mean, Jerry Cantrell wrote more like metal riffs. They had cool melodies, and they could definitely straddle both sides of the fence. Whereas you take Nirvana, Nevermind. To me, Nevermind, with Butch Vig, I mean, yeah, that was a full blown major label record. But you know what? So was the Sex Pistols' Nevermind the Bollocks. If you talk to Steve Jones or any of those guys about that album cost a lot of money, was very, at least as I understand it, was very meticulously produced and crafted. And it wasn't this big, sort of, explosion of just natural disaster that happened as much as it sounds like it was. And Nevermind was kind of the same thing. It was, it was a very meticulously crafted record, mistakes and all, you know what I mean? And that's kind of the beauty of it, is that, how well it was produced and how well it was made, that it sounded like this perfect mistake, but it wasn't. It was actually very well thought out. And, you go back to the money, the truth of it is, Bob, being a, young band guy partying, and just rocking the free world like most of us do, the truth of it is, we have no idea how much money record companies have in radio budgets and all that crap. Because we don't know, and we're probably on drugs and partying, and we don't know, and you find out later, what that's all about. But I think to a large degree, a lot of groups, some people come up with they get the longer straw, and they get to be the Cinderella story. Pearl Jam, a lot of these bands, that's what happened to them. They for whatever reason, they were the lucky ones. They got invited to the dance, and these labels threw tons of money at them, and to some degree, big success doesn't just happen. It gets bought, and it needs that behind it in order to make it happen.
Got a question for you and Bob. I think I know Neeley's answer on this one, but are any of those records in some of your top favorite albums of all time? And if so, which ones would they be? I mean, what are your 3 or 4 or 5 favorite of the grunge records of all time, and where would you rank them in your favorite album?
I would say, that's a good question. I would say Pearl Jam 10. I love it. I think it's a great record. I also like Jeff Ament as a bass player, so I kind of have I'm a fan of his playing. But I like that record. I think the Nevermind record is really cool. I'd put that up there, and I would also put, probably the first 2 Alice in Chains records. I don't know, Soundgarden probably up in there somewhere, and I don't even know which one, quite honestly, but, maybe the second Soundgarden record might be my favorite. And to be honest with you, Temple of the Dog. I thought that was an awesome record.
Absolutely. I liked a lot of the albums. Again, what bugged me was when the albums first came out, I really liked it, but just like any band that got played to death, like Guns N' Roses or anything, you just got sick and tired of it, so fast. I think, again, it's so overplayed. But when it first came out, I would say the first, Facelift by Alice in Chains I would have in there, and probably Loud Love by Soundgarden. I remember just loving that album when it came out. Now, Nirvana, I thought wrote good songs, but I was never that big on Nirvana. And same with Pearl Jam. I think Pearl Jam and Nirvana, Dave, again, you talked about production. And I think after seeing these bands live, you could tell how greatly produced some of the records were, especially that Pearl Jam 10. Who was it? Brendan O'Brien? Is that who produced that?
Right. Yep. Right.
I mean, brilliant. They were associated with greatness, and I think again, this is where the record label was smart. They put them with a great. I love the production because it's so raw, but it's still kind of got that arena rock feel. It's a big sound, And Mark Pellington doing the Jeremy video was brilliant. I never liked that song, but seeing it as a video, the video was brilliant. But who do you credit, the director, Pellington, or the band? They were associated with greatness, but as a band itself, I thought Pearl Jam was terribly average, to be honest with you.
Well, I always enjoyed the little argument that went on as to, I can't tell the difference between Pearl Jam and Stone Temple Pilots. There was such a confusion.
I actually like Stone Temple Pilots better. I think they had better songs.
There was such confusion.
I do too. I would agree with you, Bob. Yep.
There was always this confusion. Is that Stone Temple Pilots or is that Pearl Jam? Because they had a very similar sound in the very beginning.
Well, just let's not forget, I really think Soundgarden, for example, just kept getting better and better. I love Down on the Upside, Super Unknown. They're probably my 2 favorite Soundgardens. Nirvana, Bleach is an amazing album. There's a couple early ones, Mudhoney EP, Superfuzz Big Muff, Green River, Rehab Doll. There's some great albums in there. And Pearl Jam, 10 never really hit it for me big time. I would say Versus is probably my favorite. But you look at just what these big bands did, and there are a lot of great albums there.
I think there were more great songs than great albums, like Soundgarden, especially toward the end. I thought their albums were boring as hell, but they had good songs and good ideas here and there. Same with bands like Tad. mean, like the song Greasebox, that's just an ass kicker. And I actually thought that Mother Love Bone, that was a great album, even though they did some of it.
Yeah, that's a good one, man. Mother Love Bone, which essentially became Pearl Jam, with a new singer. That was a great, and a cool singer. And I will say that, that was one thing that came, especially with Cornell and even the Mother Love Bone guy and even Eddie Vedder. I mean, love him or hate him, he's got a sound that's very identifiable when you hear him. And of course, Cobain as well. Then a lot of these guys, I think it's kind of cool when you've got really identifiable vocals. And Cornell and Lane Staley probably being two of my favorites from that whole era. Because I grew up like a big BTO fan, and like Burton Cummings from Guess Who, and they just had these, like you referenced the 70s, Bob. They had like these 70s powerhouse, just very manly sounding voices, as opposed to what was happening with all the 80s hair band crap, where it was all just like, they look like chicks, they sound like chicks, and then as a result, all the dudes dress like chicks because all the chicks are there,
What do you think there, Neeley?
Well, I wanted to bring up the fact when Metallica, the biggest metal band in the world, tried to lean toward the more alternative sound, to where the hardcore Metallica fans had a little bit of a backlash referring to Metallica as Alternica. Anybody else heard that one before?
That's a good one.
Yeah, they were referring to them as Alternica. They didn't even refer to them as Metallica anymore because people weren't even considering them metal anymore.
Far Cry from Alcoholica.
Right.
I remember that.
Right.
Well, a lot of the bands were doing that, but I think, again, going back to it, a lot of the bands were kind of forced to do that because, like, as David said, when, a great band that has history, like Megadeth, can't even get their video played, even though the record is, a killer record, still selling great, the band's still selling out arenas, they present MTV with a video and they decline them. I mean, what's a band to do? And I think that's why, a lot of these bands, like you mentioned earlier, Warrant and Dokken, tried doing the grunge thing. I mean, I thought it was so funny when first time I saw Soundgarden, me and my friends thought they were great. Oh, this is amazing. It was at the Foundations, and I remember seeing some popular LA, not glam metal, but hair metal guys there just come up, oh, this stuff is shit. This is fucking horrible. And like 6-7 months later, I see these same guys wearing their Doc Martens and flannels and being all grunge, And it's just funny how, in the case of the 90s, it's almost like you had to give in because that was the only way you could get yourself played.
Well, one thing I want to, ask Dave here, his perspective from being in Megadeth, especially in the last half of the 90s there. Motley Crue, of course, they attempted to do the whole grunge thing with that horrible Generation Swine release. And then, Megadeth teamed up with them, and for just a short part of the tour, Anthrax was on that bill, and Anthrax dropped off. But how strange was it for you, Dave, to team up with Motley Crue with Megadeth?
It was very strange because that was not a peak for any of us, including Anthrax or Motley, and it was pretty slim pickings out there as far as trying to put a bill together. We had just come off of, Cryptic Writings, which had helped our band reinvent at, with the help of American FM radio, which was playing a lot of, metal, at least quasi-metal, but mostly a lot of new metal. Seven Dust, Creed, these kind of things. So we kind of got grandfathered into that movement because we had success a few years earlier with like Symphony of Destruction and, legitimate, metal tracks. So, but it was weird to try to be on a bill like that with Motley because, they were the quintessential, 80s arena rock band, whereas we were more of a 90s. And I wouldn't even, even though we played arenas, we were never an arena rock band. And again, it was pretty slim pickings as to what log do you jump over to get down the river, because we're not going to hang it up. We're not going to quit. We're in this for better or for worse. But how do you make this work? And quite honestly, I think Motley was probably doing the same thing, scratching their heads going, oh, my God, who would have ever thought we'd have a couple of thrash metal bands opening for us?
Well, the other one where I met you in two different occasions there, Dave, is on the Motley Crue tour I met you. And then you guys, for your Risk tour, you took Static X out, and strangely enough, another Seattle band, New American Shame, which I thought was an absolutely stellar band. What was your thoughts on that?
Well, it's interesting. I remember, we'd usually be on the tour bus, and we would get a band submitted to us. And the one that really comes to mind is both Korn and Stone Temple Pilots, was actually before that on the Countdown record. And I remember, we'd get these things, the management would send these out, say, hey, these are some bands that are, their labels are submitting, wanting to be supported, the opening band for the upcoming tour. So we'd sit and we'd listen to them. And, some of them, like STP was just kind of like a no-brainer. It was like, this is a great band. These guys have good songs. This is cool. And I don't know if our fans are going to eat them for lunch or if this is going to work or not, but whatever. We like them. It's cool. Let's take them out. Korn being kind of a bit of an anomaly, you go, what the hell is this? It's like, this is way, nobody's doing this. And so maybe just for that reason alone, hey, nobody's doing this. All right, let's take a chance on this. This is cool. But, like you say, the Risk, then by the time it got to the Risk album, was like, that was just a strange time period, because I think even internally, Marty Friedman was wanting to stretch out and, go in different directions, and we were trying to hang on to what had worked with Cryptic Writings, and yet, of course, Dave and I growing up through the thrash thing, hanging on to what we could from that. I mean, everything was just it was like being in a sandstorm. You couldn't even see. You know what I mean? It's like everything was in musically, in our own scene, in the industry. Just everything was so whacked at that time that you were just kind of grasping in a vine to just hold on to, find some solid ground to stand on. Again, the Motley Tour, and then the bands you just referenced there too. It's corrected itself now, hasn't it? Where it's Slayer and Lamb of God. I mean, there's more of a focus now of like, okay, thrash metal has kind of revived itself and gotten back up and running. But that was a very weird time back then. And by the late '90s, it's like all the rugs had been pulled out from under everybody, and it was really difficult just to even survive back in those days.
So would you attribute that to the obviously what dominated the 90s was the grunge movement? Would you attribute that as the hangover from the grunge movement that caused that upheaval in the industry, and for bands like Megadeth trying to find their balance there?
Yeah, I would for sure, because I think like the topic we're talking about, it started with grunge. And I think that's when all of us metalheads went, there's trouble brewing here. And then it turned into full-blown alternative music. And then, of course, in the middle of that, Korn and nu metal comes out. And I'm not one of these purists. It's like, bring back the old school and keep it pure and don't ever change anything. Because that's a delusion too. The world changes. Life evolves. So I don't agree with that whole attitude either. But you're right. All of those things caused this huge shift everywhere. And by the late 90s and even into early, 2000, probably 2002, 2003 even, it took about 5 years in there, where there was really no direction to any of it. I mean, grunge was gone. Nu metal was whacked. Alternative music was just now, it wasn't even alternative anymore. It was the norm. Alternative became the mainstream, So, and metal music was kind of regrouping and right, it's like a lot of these metalcore bands started coming out. It's almost that's how disgusted everybody was as it turned into metalcore.
Well, I didn't mean to hijack your show here, Bob, so take it away.
Let's go ahead and end this through. We'll kind of get a last statement from everyone. I'll start out by saying, again, my view when grunge music came out, I thought the music scene needed a great kick in the ass. I saw a lot of these bands in the clubs. I thought they were great. The one thing that I don't think these bands were experienced arena rock bands, though. That's another thing, is seeing them live. I think they took off way too soon. I think, the thrash bands, of course, the 70s bands, the Maidens, and even bands, Scorpions, they took years and years of playing before they got to the arena level, and it really showed. And seeing some of these bands, even a band like Alice in Chains, who I loved, seeing them on the arena, it was like, unfamiliar territory to them, you know. I mean, I remember seeing Candlebox at the Whiskey, and when the first Candlebox record came in, I actually liked it. I go, there's some good songs here. They got some talent, and so the grunge scene was in full force, and it wasn't like before seeing Soundgarden and stuff, where it was still kind of fresh and exciting. By the time I saw Candlebox, it was the boringest fucking show I ever saw in my life. The singer's just standing there, it's like purposely not wanting to entertain the audience. You know, you'd like lift the microphone to his mouth, only you, and then just stand there on stage. Like, when could I get off the stage kind of thing? And then, you know, I'm looking around, everyone's just all depressed. And you remember back in the 80s, you used to have that crazy guy that would be behind you that you always despised. You'd be spilling beer, yelling, woo! Battle! That kind of thing. You know, you just hated seeing that guy on all the shows. You kind of miss that guy. You know, at the grunge shows, you're going, where is that guy? You know, where's the excitement in the audience, man? Where's people getting into it? You know, everyone's just like standing there. I'm going, God, this is horrible. This band is bombing. And then after the show, all these press people that wrote for all these artsy magazines back then, you know, they all look like Janine Garofalo types, you know, all going, oh, that was so amazing. That singer's so emotional. Oh, it was just brilliant. I'm going, well, what's brilliant? It's boring, man. It's nothing that's not entertainment, you know? And, it's artistic and all this kind of bullshit. It just got too stupid where they were like purposely trying to avoid anything that had to do with rock and roll, including just good, clean entertainment and having a good time and just being truthful and putting on a show. And that's my whole thing. Although I really welcome in any kind of newer rock metal bands, I just think the grunge scene was way overplayed and just way overhyped, and including a lot of the alternative rock and metal of that era. Anyway, go ahead, Neeley. What's your closing thought?
Are you talking about this guy here, Bob?
Oh, rock and roll!
That's it! Dude, I tell you, I was walking around the Whiskey going, where is that guy? I miss that fucking guy. And you know what? Last week I saw him at the Judas Priest Whitesnake show. In fact, I saw like about 10 of them there, man. Spilling beer, getting drunk, and it was like I gave him a big hug, man. Where have you been, man?
Rock and roll, man! Woo!
Is that the guy?
That's him.
Well, you know, I'm glad that period in music history has come and gone. I thank the grunge movement for inspiring me to start the Classic Metal Show and be doing this for 14 years and be able to meet cool guys like Dave and, of course, you, Bob, and Mr. Martin Popoff, and, you know, all the people that I've encountered over the last 14 years. And you know, it wasn't all bad. Like I said, there was a few highlights in that whole era for me personally, but I'm just glad that hard melodic metal or rock is back. I'm glad to see guitar solos are back. I'm glad to see singers that can actually sing are back. So it was a rough road for about 20 years, but we've turned over a new leaf, and you older rockers like you, Dave, you guys are still out there doing it and hooking up with my good friend Tim Owens. Awesome move, you know. So guys like you,
yes, thank you.
Still waving that metal flag, and you know the Classic Metal Show will be here to support guys like you, as well as you, Martin, and of course you, Bob. That goes without saying. So again, Bob, thanks for having me on your podcast again.
You got it. And where could they hear the Classic Metal Show, Mr. Neeley?
Every Saturday night. Just tune in over at theclassicmetalshow.com. Starts at 9 p.m. Eastern time, and we go all the way to 3 a.m. in the morning, and we take phone calls. We're all live. We got a chat room. You know, it's just a very interactive show, and it's specifically for all the metal fans out there who want to hang out with us for 6 full hours. So theclassicmetalshow.com.
Great. I was going to say, if you can't make it on Saturday nights to listen to the show, they could hear most of the episodes on podcast form, right?
Some of the better segments we do during the live show ends up on a podcast on iTunes or on YouTube or any one of our accounts. There's links over at theclassicmetalshow.com where you can hear it. And then, of course, we've got a dozen affiliates all over the world that replay the show through the week. So there's probably not an hour in the day through the week where you can't hear the Classic Metal Show at some point on some affiliate.
Right, and of course the Classic Metal Show also houses the Shockwave Skull Sessions.
It'll be interesting to hear this segment on the CMS radio network.
Yeah, that's a good one. Martin, why don't you give your final thoughts about this topic?
Okay, well, my thoughts, I guess, are this. I look at it much, much more positively, but also I'm looking at it as sort of a 1988 to 1992 thing. I do maintain that probably 10 of my top 100 albums of all time are grunge albums. But to me, it's the Green River first EP and album. It's the Mudhoney first EP. It's the Soundgarden first EP. It's the second Pearl Jam album. It's actually Soundgarden, like I say, their last two records. But basically, I look on it as this great, very, very tight little thing, and all those criticisms that we've been talking about are absolutely, completely valid, but most of them really are something that we're talking 92 through to the year 2000. I mean, I think the beginning was an amazing, amazing time. It gave me one of those extra little blips of being an enthusiastic, crazy, crazy enthusiastic music fan again. I've had them since. I had them before. I was a big, late 80s Minneapolis music guy. I loved the Replacements, Soul Asylum, Husker Du. That was one tight little blip. So was punk. As a kid, metal all the time, obviously, new wave of British heavy metal, but a big, very, very closely defined one, tight with a lot of great, great music, was the grunge movement, but the early days of it, 88 to 92, and then it's over and out kind of thing.
All right. Of course, you can catch all Martin's latest works at martinpopoff.com. You can order all his books through there and through Amazon.com as well, right, Martin?
Yes, absolutely. That stuff's all there, and this has been a lot of fun, Bob. I mean, I love that you do these things, and this is one that probably a lot of us don't get to talk about very much. So it will be interesting to see the reaction to this. I've learned a lot from this too, and it's been a really cool experience.
It was good, long overdue conversation. And Martin, also bravewords.com. You could catch all your articles and stuff there, right?
Yeah, we're doing reviews and stuff there, but the one bit of news that I forgot to mention is the big thing that I'm working on every day is we're doing the official authorized Rush movie right now.
That's right.
That's with Sam Dunn and Scott McFadden, who did Global Metal, Metal: A Headbanger's Journey, and Iron Maiden Flight 666. So the next movie, it's nearing completion. It's well over half done. Put it that way. It's going to be really, really cool. The interviews, the people that have been interviewed for it, you'll be pretty amazed.
And what's your involvement? Yeah. Are you actually co-directing with Sam?
No. I've been research, conceptual stuff, coming up with questions, finding memorabilia, finding video footage, audio footage. I've been basically in there hands-on, doing all sorts of things. But Sam is still very much running things. Sam and Scott. Sam is doing all the interviews. I'm transcribing a lot of the interviews. Well, actually, I've transcribed almost all the interviews, so that's been kind of cool. I've seen all of them in their entirety. It's going to be a very, very cool movie. All
right, and David Ellefson, what do you got going on now, my friend?
Yeah, I agree, Bob. I'm glad you brought this up. This is obviously a hot button topic, if you will, in metal. Because so many people are such purists and anything that moved the tribe away from what we knew it to be as metal in the late 80s, early 90s, grunge and alternative music certainly gets the blame. But at the same time, like we talked about, there was a lot of merit and some good stuff that did come out of it. And probably the best thing that came out of it is it finally inspired everybody to revive metal again. And it's probably back stronger and healthier now than it's been since the early 90s, since about 1992 or 93. So, and as everything, it's kind of, sometimes it has to kind of fall to the ground and rise out of its own ashes again. And I think that's what's happened to the metal movement. So to some degree, I think we should be thankful that it kind of, we earned it, we burned it, and then we rose back up from our own ashes.
Right on, guys. And David, people could get in touch with you in a number of ways, huh? Why don't you throw out your sites?
Sure, yeah, on the web, just davidellefson.com, or if you're on MySpace, you can do myspace.com/David Ellefson and the number 1, David Ellefson 1. So all my stuff is up there. And if you're on YouTube, you can do David Ellefson's Rock Shop, where I talk about a lot of music business things, and some playing stuff. That's just David Ellefson's Rock Shop on YouTube.
Right on. Well, gentlemen, it was definitely a pleasure. I want to thank you all, and we'll definitely keep in touch. We'll talk real soon.
All right.
Thanks. See you guys.
Thank you for listening to the Shockwaves Skull Sessions podcast. Subscribe and listen to all episodes by going to our pages on iTunes, Spreaker, YouTube, Spotify, and more. You can listen to all other episodes and access up-to-date information and news on the Shockwaves Skull Sessions podcast by going to our website at www.shockwaveskullsessions.com. Email all comments, questions, and suggestions to shockwaveskullsessions@gmail.com.